Welcome back, folks, to my top 50 favorite board games of all time. Today we're going to be talking about numbers 30 through 21. We've got a few in this section that have risen quite a bit since last year, and at least one that has dropped quite a bit since last year. So there's been a little bit of moving and shaking going on in this part of the list. My number 30 game is the second in the trekking series, and this is actually the first of the trekking series that I bought, and it's Trekking the National Parks. This game is really cool. It's got a lot of Ticket to Ride vibes to it. You are traveling around the board, visiting national parks, you're collecting these souvenir stones. The only reason that this game isn't higher, and I have a feeling it's going to slowly drop on my list, and we'll probably end up flip-flopping with Trekking Through History, because Trekking Through History is kind of rising, and this one's kind of falling. And the only reason for that is that this game is a little simplistic, and the more you play it, it kind of ends up being the same game over and over. But it's a great game to teach people. It's super easy. It's one of the first games that I pull off the shelf for people who are kind of new to gaming, but they want to start digging their teeth into things. Because it's a great game. There's some good decisions, especially there's a postcard expansion that adds a little bit to it. And the first time I teach this game, I typically don't include that. But once you add that in, it's one more level of decision making. So it's a really good game, pretty artwork. That's Trekking the National Parks. The next game on my list has risen 16 spots, and it's one of my favorite two-player card games. Actually, I have the app on my phone. I play the app way more than I play the actual physical copy. And this game is Lost Cities. This game sort of has a theme to it. I mean, it's a pasted-on theme. It's an Indiana Jones type thing where you're supposed to be exploring different ancient civilizations or something. But really, it's just colored cards with different numbers on them. Numbers 1 through 10 or 2 through 10. And essentially, you're playing those cards. You have to play them in order from low to high. And you and your opponent are just going back and forth playing cards in these different areas. There are 5 different sections of the board that you can explore, but you don't have to explore all of them. And each one that you explore, you start off sort of in a deficit of negative 20 points, and so you have to score at least 20 points in that area in order to make up that gap, and you're gonna have to score more than 20 if you actually want to gain points in that area. So there's a cool risk reward mechanism in it, like, do I think I'm going to get enough, you know, in the white or the red to actually make a go of it? And you're going based on limited information because you only have a certain number of cards in your hands. And so you don't know at the beginning what you're going to end up getting. And so you're sort of doing that math in your head with the probability like, okay, I got a 50-50 shot that I'm going to get one of these. And it's a really fun game. It's a very quick game. Like I said, the app is great. But Lost Cities is a fantastic two-player game. Number 28 on my list is one of the most famous, if not the most famous, cooperative game out there, and that's Pandemic. Pandemic is a really cool game where there are 4 different diseases that are spreading around the world, and you are working together, you and whoever, you know, your other players are working together to stop these diseases and to find cures for the disease. And so each player takes on a different role as a medic or a quarantine specialist or a researcher or whatever. And you're using your special abilities to try to help your team to stop the spread of these diseases and to cure the diseases. And if you cure these 4 diseases, you win the game. And this is an amazing design. A lot of different co-op games have sort of borrowed some of the ideas with the way the card play works in this game, because you'll end up with an epidemic card, and when you pull that epidemic card, you have to shuffle the cards that have already been drawn and put them back on top of the deck. So those cities that have already been infected are going to end up getting infected again, which makes it worse. And it's really cool design in terms of being able to ramp up the difficulty as well. The first couple times I played this game, we were just so bad at it. And I'm like, there's no way we're going to win this game. Well, you can change the difficulty level by taking out epidemic cards or putting in more epidemic cards. And it just, you know, changes how difficult the whole thing's going to be. And so what we did is we ramped it way down, like below beginner, and we won it. And then that clues you into, okay, I see how this works, and then you can ramp the difficulty back up. So this is a really cool game. It's a very challenging game, which makes it really fun. It's got a cool map, neat components. That's Pandemic. The next game on my list, number 27, is one that I think would probably be higher on my list if I could just get it to the table more often. But this game works best with 4 or 5 players. It's a higher player count, definitely makes the game better. And the challenge with this game is when you introduce it to new people, they can screw up the game. And this game's called Puerto Rico. But the idea behind Puerto Rico is you are colonizing Puerto Rico and you're building different crops in your field, like sugar and indigo and tobacco and coffee, and then you're generating those goods and you're sending them back to Europe. But the action selection mechanism in this game is what makes it really cool. Each turn I get to pick, you know, which action I want to take on the board. And, you know, one of them will be is the craftsman, which generates all your goods. It basically kicks in all your fields and all your industries to generate those goods. One would be the ship captain to send the goods back home. Another one generates money. Another one allows you to build buildings. Another one, you can plant more fields. And so when I select that action, everybody around the table gets to take that action. But I get a bonus. I get to take that action plus a little bit more, which makes it really cool. But what I mentioned was that the sequence of that action selection can really have a big impact on the game. And somebody who's new won't understand that until they've seen it happen. But depending on what my neighbor picks, you know, it could really advantage me. And so somebody who's sitting to the left of a newbie is going to do really well. And so that makes this game tough because it can kind of screw up the game and make it not competitive if you're playing it with newer folks. And so it makes it a little bit difficult to get this game to the table, but Puerto Rico is fantastic. All right, my number 26 on the list is a game that has probably dropped the furthest or pretty close to the furthest on my list. And I think my kids are going to be surprised that this one has dropped this far. It's dropped 22 spots, and that's Age of Empires 3. At one time, this game was, I think I had ranked as my favorite game of all time, or it was in the top 3. A couple things happened this year that made me sort of rethink this. One, I introduced it a couple different times to some new players, and I didn't find it to be as fun as what I had remembered when I, was playing it with my kids. It's pretty easy to teach, not real difficult, but I don't know, maybe because I've played more games now, this one just didn't sort of have the excitement level that some of the other games have that I've played. The second thing is, when I went back to reteach this game, I hadn't played it in a while, and so I went back and I brushed up on the rules. And like often happens, you got to call me, you guys got to double check me if I'm teaching you games. As often happens, we were playing the game wrong. And there were 2 pretty significant rules that we had wrong. One of them was, I thought, a good thing. Like, I was happy to find that we were playing it wrong. Where you can go all-out warfare against somebody and have this giant battle. And a lot of times when we were playing it in the past, having a lot of soldiers was a huge advantage because you could just, wipe out your opponents with your soldiers. And so I thought that particular rule, when I realized we're playing it wrong, that made the game better. But there's another rule that we were playing wrong, and now that we're playing it right, I think it actually diminishes the game a little bit. And that is when you take your explorers over to the new world, you will discover new lands. And the way we were playing it, when you discovered those lands, each land is associated with a particular good. Like if you discover in the Caribbean, you get sugar. If you discover in Canada, you're going to get furs. In Peru, you're going to get gold. And what we were doing is we would award that token for the good to whoever discovered that land, which made sense, okay? But what we found out was you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to award that token to the first person to get 3 colonists in that region. So in other words, somebody goes over and discovers it, but you don't actually start producing those goods until you get enough colonists over there to be able to do some production, which that makes sense too, thematically. But the trouble was it sort of threw off the balance of the game, because discovering new lands is a pretty risky strategy, because you have to fight natives and you don't know how many are there, and so there's a pretty high risk with doing that. And when you get there and you got that extra good, that sort of paid off, you know, it gave you incentive to take that risk. Well, now there's not so much incentive, and there are missionaries in this game, which when you take your missionaries over, you get to add more people, because it's kind of like you're converting the natives or whatever. And it made the missionary strategy way better, and to the point where it's almost, I'm not sure that you can win. Whoever takes that missionary strategy is going to end up winning, whoever perfects it. And so I kind of feel like it almost narrowed the possibilities for all these different strategies that you could take to win the game, which was one of my favorite things about the game, is you could take 5 different approaches to it and see who could perfect it, right? And I feel like it narrowed it down to, like, there's one good way to win, and if you don't follow that way, you might not have much of a chance. So I'm not sure that's true. I got that sense just the last time or two that I've played it, now that we've fixed that rule. And so I need to get it back to the table and try it again. But if that turns out to be true, this game may end up dropping some more, or we may just go back to doing it the way we did it at the beginning and house rule it and change it ourselves. But Age of Empires 3 is still a really great game. Cool miniatures, pretty easy to learn. Definitely a game that will stay on my list for a long time. Number 25 on my list is actually a sequel to another game called Manhattan Project, and this game's called Manhattan Project Energy Empire. And it's sort of a sequel. A lot of the mechanisms are the same. It's a worker placement game, which is one of my favorite types of games, where you're putting out little dudes and they're doing things for you on the map. A lot of the iconography on this game is the same as Manhattan Project, but the objectives are quite a bit different. So it's sort of in the same universe, but they're very different games. And I actually like this one, Manhattan Project Energy Empire. I like it way better. This game is set in sort of the 1950s, 1960s Cold War era, and you are different nations around the world trying to build up your industrial capacity and generate lots of energy, but you're also having to balance the pollution in your environment. You don't want to pollute your environment too much, and it's a super cool game. I would call it sort of mid-weight game. It's a step up from Ticket to Ride or Trekking the National Parks or games like that. It's a little bit more in depth than that, but it's not a super heavy game. It does take a little bit of setup. There's lots of components, lots of pieces to put out on the table. But this is a really fun one, Manhattan Project Energy Empire. So I just mentioned this mechanism called worker placement, and the reason it's called that is you get a certain number of dudes, a certain number of meeples or pieces that you put on the board, and depending on where you put those workers, you are going to get to do certain actions. And this next game on my list, which has risen 22 spots, it's risen as much as any other game this year, just because I've had a chance to get it back to the table and play it more, is Stone Age. And Stone Age, to me, is really a quintessential worker placement game, because you have these little cavemen and you're putting them out on the board and you're using them to hunt and gather food to feed your people, or you're using them to chop wood or make bricks or pan for gold, and then you're taking those resources and you're using those resources to expand your village or to invest in technology. And it's really, that's the basis for almost every single worker placement game. But this one sort of distills it down to a point where it's really easy to teach, it's easy to learn. There's a dice rolling aspect to it, which I'm not usually a huge dice rolling fan because of the randomness, and for whatever reason, everybody probably feels this way, but I feel like I just don't roll. The randomness never works in my favor. But anyway, there are also tools in this game which allow you to mitigate the dice. So if you have a bad roll, you can kind of fix it if you have some tools, which is cool. And there's a lot of different approaches you can take to this game. Again, just like I mentioned before, I like games where there's maybe 5 or 10 different strategies that you can take, and each time you can try a new one every time you play the game. So I got this to the table a couple times this year, and it just sort of reinforced how solid this game is and how great it is, especially as an entry into worker placement games. And that's Stone Age. So my number 23 is another cooperative game, and I mentioned Pandemic earlier. If I'm looking for a cooperative game to introduce to kids, Pandemic is a theme that kids probably aren't going to be that interested in, especially after going through COVID. But it's a little bit more of a theme for adults, I guess, a little more serious theme. And so the game that I introduce co-ops to kids is often Castle Panic. Castle Panic is great because it's more of an adventure theme. There's a castle in the middle of the board, and we're all working together to fight off trolls and orcs and goblins and these different bad monsters to try to protect our castle. And it's a very simple game. These guys just keep coming out of the woods and keep trying to attack your castle, and you keep fighting them off. And you have different cards with archers and knights and swordsmen, and they're going to move in concentric circles towards your castle. And when they're farther out, you shoot them with the bow and arrow, and your archers hit them. If they make it further in, you send the cavalry in, and you try to get them with your knights. And if they make it all the way up close to your castle, you get your swordsmen, your infantry guys out there, and you fight them. And then there's a bunch of special cards too. And so it's a really easy game. The thing I love about this game is it always seems to come down to the last turn. And so there's a real good level of excitement, like, oh man, are we going to make it? And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. It's not a hard game to win. We win more often than we lose. And there's a big box version that we have here at the shop that adds in a whole bunch of other elements. I'm not a huge fan of the big box version just because it takes an extra half an hour to set it up, because you got to go through and pick out certain pieces that you don't use and then add these and do this, and it just adds a layer of complexity that I'm not really looking for. If I pick out Castle Panic, it's because I want a simple game that's easy to teach, and so I don't necessarily want those extra levels of complexity. Now I got a little guy, Monroe, who comes into my shop though. He loves Castle Panic with the Wizards expansion, and so we'll be keeping it on the shelf just for Monroe, because that's like his favorite game. But the kids love Castle Panic. It's a great, exciting game. You know, there's lots of action, and so it's one that I highly recommend. Number 22 on my list is a game that has one of my favorite themes, and it's a game that, in terms of theme and mechanism, I think just hits the nail right on the head. And that game is Founding Fathers. Founding Fathers is about the Constitutional Convention, and you are playing different delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And on your turn, there's a few things you can do. You can get with other people from your state to vote on different articles of the Constitution. You could go into the debate room and make a debate. What you're trying to do is become the most influential founding father. And so you do that by scoring the most points. But there are a few different ways to score points. The coolest part of this game is each card, it has a historical aspect to it. So, you know, each guy that's in the game that was part of the Constitutional Convention, it tells you a little bit of the history of that person and their role. But that person's card also has a special ability that you can use, and that ability is related to what they actually did at the Constitutional Convention, which is super cool. You have different factions in this game, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. You have the small states proponents and the big states proponents. So it's actually kind of a cool teaching thing too. The kids learn a little bit. But the game is really fun. It's a very tight game. So a lot of times, you know, the final comes down to a couple points, a point or two. And the more I play it, I realize there's a short-term strategy and a long-term strategy. You could go for the big points at the end, or you could just try to score points as you go and build up a little bit of a lead so that the guy who's going for those points at the end may or may not catch you. So there's just enough decision space in this game, you know, to make it interesting. But for me, the theme is what totally sells it, because they did such a great job of integrating the history with the gameplay. And that's Founding Fathers. All right, the last game for this section, number 21, is a game that I actually taught and played last night. It's been a while. This game is a huge hit with my scouts when we played this at the Boy Scout lock-ins, because they got to beat each other up a little bit. But this game is Citadels. And the cool thing about Citadels, it has a mechanism sort of like Puerto Rico. It's an action selection mechanism where you get to choose each round who you want to be, which character you want to take the role of. But the cool thing about this is it's card drafting. So whoever's the king gets to look at all the cards, and they get first choice, and they decide who they want to be that round. Maybe they want to remain the king, or maybe they want to be the thief or the architect, because each person, each role allows you to do something special. Maybe they want to be the warlord, which allows you to knock down other people's buildings. But in this game, what you're trying to do is you're trying to build up your medieval city, and the first person to build 8 buildings, that's going to trigger the end of the game. And so there are some cheap buildings that you can build, and there are some expensive buildings you can build. If you build the cheap ones, there's a chance the warlord could come along and knock them down. If you build the big ones, other people around the table are looking at you like, oh, this guy's in the lead, we got to go get him. And so you become a target. But the cool aspect about this game is, let's say I pick the thief card. I don't get to say, I want to thief, I want to steal from you, okay? I have to pick another role that I'm going to steal from. So I might say, oh, I'm going to steal from the bishop. But I don't know who the bishop is, because I don't know who picked that card. And maybe I'm trying to steal from you because I think you picked the bishop, but you actually picked the architect this turn. And so it's a really cool game, because a lot of times you are trying to target a certain player and you end up accidentally targeting another player. It can also be pretty frustrating, especially if somebody plays the assassin or the thief and they kill you or steal your money inadvertently 2 or 3 times in a row. It can be really deflating and really a really tough one. The one thing that kind of grinds me about this game is that if everybody's tuned in and paying attention, the game can go quick. But if people suffer from analysis paralysis and you have these 6 cards in your hand and it takes you 5 minutes to decide, the game can grind to a halt and it can be really slow. I love this game when it's quick and snappy and people keep moving and everybody's tuned in and paying attention. You know, if somebody's on their phone, oh, it's my turn, you know, that can really ruin the whole game. And so if everybody's into this and they're paying attention, it can be fantastic, and it can be a really rollicking good time. So I highly recommend Citadels. All right, folks, so that's it for this 10. Come on back next time, and we'll start into the top 20. See ya.